Ever wonder why narcissistic people need so much approval, so much validation, so much reassurance? Ironically, the idea that the narcissist always wants to look in the mirror actually ties into the idea and the theoretical musing that back in early life, when they really needed a mirror, there wasn't one around. And not a mirror on the wall, but the mirror that you get from someone seeing you and getting you. This series on how to, or ideally how not, to make or raise a narcissist gets at the various dynamics that sort of relate to some of the origins of narcissism. No one of these paths is the reason someone goes on to develop a narcissistic personality, but these things combine and represent risk factors. Some kids have these experiences and don't go on to develop narcissistic personalities. In fact, that's probably what's more normal. So let's talk about this idea of how to or how not to make a narcissist and focus on something called mirroring. I'm going to specifically talk about mirroring in childhood, and I'm not talking about the creepy mirroring that adults and in fact that narcissistic people do to manipulate people, but I'm talking about mirroring that a child receives. Mirroring during childhood is a critical developmental process. One of the most important theorists out there about narcissism, someone named Heinz Kohut, talked a lot about mirroring as a pathway and really about how a lack of mirroring can predict the development of narcissistic personality in adulthood. Simply put, mirroring is something that every infant and child needs. The child looks to the world outside of it, outside of the child, to learn. That's how the child learns in a social developmental framework. And especially they look to the world outside of them to learn about themselves. A mirroring parent is an attuned parent. Let's say there's a sad child. The sad child looks at the parent, and the parent, attuned to their child, mirrors back that sadness, understands it, comforts the child, and lets the child be with the emotion without shaming them or asking them to get rid of the emotion. The child looks to the parent or the caregiver's face and sees an expression and a reaction that is responsive, that mirrors something. Basically, good mirroring that happens day after day after day for years means that the parent is present and attuned with the child. Mirroring means that the child has been provided an emotional mirror. Approval when it is consistent with the child's behavior. Feedback that is consistent and realistic. Being a mirror means that the parent is available and the parent is aware. There are many reasons that a child may not receive good mirroring in their early years. And again, some of these are difficult reasons. It's not always fair, but these reasons could range from their parents literally not having empathy, the parents needing their own validation so much that their child's mirroring needs become secondary. The parents may also be extremely distracted by stress, by their own interests, by the stuff that matters to them. The parent or the parents may be narcissistic. And in some cases, because the parent has other significant competing issues in their life, health issues, substance use, that are not adequately treated, or the parent themselves is not adequately supported to be able to do the hard work to balance the parenting and the stuff of life, or they're just not ready for it. Maybe they're too immature for it. That can also result in suboptimal mirroring. When a parent is either egocentric or overwhelmed or deeply distracted and is not adequately supported, they are more likely to miss out on addressing their child's needs. Sometimes there may even be cultural factors at play, including cultural factors that may discourage parental warmth or emotional expression, as well as cultures that rely on deeply authoritarian models of parenting, which can make discipline and control more important than being emotionally available and responsive to a child. There may also be events happening in the child's world, and literally the society around them, war, refugee experiences, upheaval. That means that survival needs of the family at large, of the parents, could end up taking precedence over mirroring a small child's emotions. So there's a whole range of things that can happen here. Now, when the caregiving mirror is inconsistent, regardless of the reason, the child is not able to develop a realistic sense of self, a realistic sense of who they are, or what their internal world is about, or how to manage emotion. And then the child maintains an unrealistic and undeveloped worldview. Without mirroring, the child may retreat into a fantasy world, which is often characterized by, as many things are for children, fantasy and grandiosity. That can help them feel safe in the world, like when they become the wizard or the hero of their own world, and help them make sense of the world. Without mirroring, children can grow into adults who still have that same grandiosity. They don't grow out of it. They still have that same grandiosity that they had as a 6-year-old child who thinks that they are a superstar or a magic person or a wizard. On top of that, without the mirroring, a child cannot evolve into an adult that has a coherent sense of self. Now, what that means is that the child, and then the adolescent, and then the adult they become, will always have to look outside into the external world in search of mirrors in the form of other people in their world to always look back at them and reassure them and validate them and say, hey, you're good. Hey, you're amazing. Hey, you're wonderful. You did good. Narcissistic adults are, in essence, 5-year-old children who are forever seeking out their parents' approval in the eyes of everyone in the world. It's actually quite heartbreaking, and the adult world obviously isn't really built for that. As a result, when the world doesn't give that unmirrored child that grows into adulthood the approval that they want, then that adult gets angry and throws a tantrum, just like a child would. Fine enough in a child, and it can be annoying in a child, but it's definitely not okay for an adult. Now, mirroring, this process of being mirrored and having that happen, it's the core of how people learn to regulate themselves. And that ability to regulate oneself is, in essence, the ability to manage emotions and experiences, especially those related to frustration and disappointment. Because mirroring, happens when you're a child, that was where you had that chance to get your emotions validated and feel safe with your emotions so you can ultimately manage them when you get older, right? So now you're like, oh, this isn't scary, it's not comfortable, but I got this. We know that people who have narcissistic personalities in adulthood cannot manage their own emotions. And a lot of that may very well be a byproduct of lacking that adequate mirroring that should have come in childhood. So instead of regulating these feelings internally, they lash those emotions out at the world. The parents or the caregiver's mirror should teach a child or result in the child internalizing the sense of being able to recognize their feelings and then allow them to learn to manage those feelings on their own as they grow up. It's the same with approval. If a child does not get this mirror, then going into adulthood, they look for approval outside of themselves to regulate instead of just being okay with, like, I think I did a good job. Emotional regulation, again, it's supposed to be an inside game. It shouldn't require things outside of us. It shouldn't require other people. It shouldn't even require other things like sex, drugs, alcohol, shopping, gambling, food. Nothing outside of us. Regulation should happen inside. But this is a paradox, and this is what folks with dysregulated personalities do and they struggle with. They use things that are outside of them. Most often, they use people to regulate. That's why they rage at you and then feel better. And that's why they rely on you and other people for their sense of self. If there had been adequate mirroring, they would learn to soothe themselves internally and not lash out at other people or rely on other people to even know who they are. To be narcissistic is to be a fully grown adult and still look to the world to stick a pacifier in your mouth so you can calm down. Heinz Kohut makes the important point that without that absolutely essential mirroring in childhood, the process of learning emotional regulation gets stunted. And then we see the adult tantrums that are so common in narcissistic people. Because they cannot tolerate the emotions inside of them, just these feelings that were never mirrored, they all honestly don't even know what to do with them. A common play is that they will project those emotions onto other people, which is why an angry narcissistic person will often accuse you of being the angry person. That projection, in some ways, is a byproduct of not having that mirroring and that sort of emotionally aware core that comes from that. Now, interestingly, therapy is a place that adults can get a sort of second chance at being mirrored. You go in, and the therapist is supposed to be fully present with your emotions and not distracted, hopefully. Their face and their voice shift at hearing your pain and hearing your joy. You feel mirrored. And that can help a person learn that their own feelings are real and that they can own them. And if the therapy is really, really good, a person can then start feeling more safe and more comfortable with their emotions. Actually, Kohut argues that doing therapy with narcissistic clients is an attempt to create the mirrored situation that they should have received in the first place during childhood. This model actually does work. I have seen narcissistic clients, I've worked with narcissistic clients who have stepped down from their anger a little bit when I have mirrored their emotion and been present with them. And the consistency of therapy means that it becomes a place where they can get that mirroring regularly. It's not as good as every day, like a child should get, but it's something. However, many narcissistic clients in therapy feel too vulnerable when their emotion is being mirrored. And at those times, it's actually not unusual for them to lash out at the therapist in the same exact way they would with partners or friends or family. As a therapist, we just have to learn not to take it too personally, but it's not always easy. As a parent, it's never too late to mirror your child, but obviously the earlier, the better. Starting mirroring your child when they're 18 years old is obviously not going to have the same impact it would have had from birth. In fact, all of us should be doing a better job of being reflective, of being present, and being aware of other people's emotions and our own. Obviously, we could all be mirrors for each other, but this process is incredibly essential for young children. So that's the mirroring part of how narcissism can slowly potentially get grown in childhood. The work on mirroring is a wake-up call to all caregivers of children, and not just parents, but other people who are in roles where they work with kids, like, for example, even teachers. And it may give people out there who are narcissistic some context about some of what their struggle is, and can give survivors of narcissistic abuse some insight into the why of the patterns they're witnessing. Remember, and I will stress this until forever, knowing the why why people become narcissistic, the origins, is not an excuse. Knowing the why, my hope, is that it's a way for you to stop blaming yourself and to recognize how difficult, if not impossible, this situation may be to change. And if you are a parent, to receive this information as a sort of preventative call to arms. It's possible to be empathic with the difficult backstory of a narcissistic person and also not be their punching bag. You can always set boundaries with grace. The other person, especially if they're a narcissistic person, may not receive them that way, but then that's on them. You can still do it. So I hope that gives you some insight into that dynamic of mirroring and the role it plays in sort of the development of narcissism, and that you're enjoying this series on how to, or ideally how not to, build a narcissist. Thanks again.